Hi, welcome back. Thank you for joining me for session 7 of my CPD series. My name's Steve Smith, and that's my Twitter handle at the bottom there. That's the address of my blog, and a reminder about informedlanguageteacher.com, where you can get research readings and videos about language teaching and language learning. So thanks for being with me again. And today we're talking about lexicogrammar. In the last session, I talked generally and quite theoretically about grammar. This one's going to be a little bit more practical. We're going to look at how you can possibly teach grammar using a lexicogrammatical approach. Firstly, I guess we need to try and explain what lexicogrammar actually means. Michael Lewis, who you can see down here and is considered, I think, probably the most important researcher and teacher associated with this sort of approach, said this in his famous book, Implementing the Lexical Approach: language consists of grammaticalized lexis, not lexicalized grammar. So, what does that mean? I suppose most of us, when we think about grammar and vocabulary, we have an idea that somehow the skeleton of a sentence is the grammar, and then we slot in vocabulary into that grammatical form. So if we teach students the grammatical rules, and if we teach them vocabulary, somehow they can put the jigsaw together and then understand and produce sentences. Now, Lewis suggested actually it's not like that. It's not really a question of bolting vocabulary onto grammar. It's the fact that vocabulary is itself grammaticalized. So, for example, if I gave you a word like listen, listen can come in various forms. So you could say he listens, or he listened, or he was listening. They are different forms of the word, listen, listens, listening, and they also perform a grammatical function to do with time frames and tense. If I gave an example from French, if we took the word beau, meaning beautiful or handsome, good looking, we know that beau can come in various forms. It could be belle, feminine singular. It could be beau with an X on, masculine plural. We've also got a noun, beauté, beauty. So one word has a grammatical role as well as just a meaning. So essentially, you can't divorce vocabulary from grammar. Now, where could this lead us in practice? Firstly, it's worth bearing in mind that many researchers say that when we learn our first language, essentially we're learning chunks of language. We hear lots and lots of repeated chunks, and by some views of this, then our brain is able to sort of pick out the most frequent chunks, combine chunks together to make acceptable sentences. And in fact, when you analyze people's use of their native language, much of our speech is in the form of formulaic chunks. It could be phrases like, here's the thing, what's my line, what's the point? The point of this is, it's a lot of sort of groups of words that we tend to use together, groups of words together in collocations. Now that's the first thing to say. Second thing I'd say is this: chunks make more efficient use of our working memory. Now our working memory, our short-term memory, is very, very limited in its capacity. It's thought to be able to hold in conscious thought maybe something between 3 to 5, let's say 4 chunks of information, bits of information. Now, those bits of information could be individual words: colourless, green, ideas, sleep. You get a bonus point, by the way, if you know where those 4 words come from. Or it could be in the form of 4 chunks. What's the point? A stitch in time saves 9. Here we go round the mulberry bush. Here's the thing. So working memory could hold just those 4 words, or it could hold all that information there, because these chunks, like what's the point, are sort of formulaic, they're unanalyzed. It's as if they're one word in a way. So if I said to you, a stitch in time, you would know the rest of that sentence saves 9. If I said, here we go round, you'd probably know already that the rest is going to be the mulberry bush. So if we work in chunks like this, it allows students to hold in their working memories during classroom exercises more information and they can therefore communicate more stuff, which makes language learning more satisfying. People would rather have things to say in sentences than just to know lists of words, for example. I'd also say this, that we know, if you're an experienced teacher, you know that most students actually struggle, given the limited time we have with them, to speak and write using the sort of traditional grammar rules plus vocab approach. It's because there are so many rules, some of them are pretty complicated, there's so many words to learn, and as soon as students are in the position of having to write something down, they tend to fall back on translating from their own language. It's just too big a task to cope with mentally for many, many students. That's not to say that some of our students haven't coped well in the past by knowing a certain number of rules, practicing them, learning vocabulary, and then with practice piecing them together and becoming quite adequate speakers or comprehenders of the language. But the reality is that most students, in the limited time we have, find that really, really difficult, and therefore can have a sense of failure. They're going to lose that self-efficacy that I've talked about in previous videos. Now, I've shown once already in a previous presentation an example of one of these sentence builders or substitution tables or sentence building frames, whatever you want to call them. And you'll see how this one's organized here. Down the left-hand side, we've got a whole series of chunks, what I like to watch, and then we've got is, are, and then we've got types of programs, and then down here, for example, last weekend, last night, so we have a switch of tense here, I saw, I watched, I went, and then an opinion, it was funny, it was super, etc., etc. So we actually have quite a rich body of language here that students could use. You'll notice that the translations are marked in. That's to make sure that all the input is totally comprehensible. So any child in the classroom, whatever their ability, knows what this language means. So, you can work with a sentence builder in various ways, chunking language in this fashion to enable students pretty quickly to be able to use in a very controlled way a limited repertoire of language. So the ways you could use this, well, if I can just go back. There's various ways of approaching something like this. You could, for example, read aloud sentences simply so that students can hear. You could then do some choral reading aloud, maybe one line at a time, or one section, or two or three sections together. You could play a guessing game, for example, where you think of a sentence, students have to guess the sentence that you're thinking of. You could do instant translation with the class, so you give them an English phrase, they come back with the French, or vice versa. Students in pairs could get each other to make up accounts. For example, one student would say, what I like to watch on TV, while their partner then gives the French, and then person A says is or are, and then partner A says c'est, and then you build up sentences in that way. And then gradually, by this sort of repetition, speaking aloud, you can begin to remove parts of the sentence builder, you can gap the sentence builder, and to produce, to give students the opportunity to be more creative and to produce language from memory. In that particular sentence builder, we had the use of ce que, which is a fairly complex use of an indefinite relative pronoun, ce que. We've got two verbs together, I like to watch. We've got the use of the passé composé, the perfect tense, I watched, I saw, and we've even got an imperfect tense in there, it was, c'était. So that's the grammar that's built in to that lexis, to those chunks. So once we've worked on it for a while, you can then have a scaffolded version with disappearing text like this, and then students, perhaps in pairs, have to try and recreate the original sentence builder. You then have the opportunity for classes who can handle it, for them to put in their own additions, a different time phrase, for example, or mixing and matching different parts of these boxes to produce their own language. Ideally, you could remove the sentence builder completely, and students would try to produce some sentences or even put more than one sentence together on their own. For example, a nice activity you can do in pairs. Once you've either you're showing them the gapped version or no version at all, partner A has to make up a sentence, partner B has to make up a different sentence, then they keep alternating until someone can't make up a sentence. That becomes somewhat competitive, produces lots of repetitions, lots of recycling of the language. And while you're doing this, of course, you're building up their phonics skills, their pronunciation skills, which, as we've seen earlier in this series of presentations, helps build up their listening skill as well. So one of these tables can be the source of lots and lots of different types of work. So have a scan down there as a possible lesson sequence that you could use with that sort of chunked sentence builder table. One of my favourites is this aural gap fill technique, where once you've removed the table and they can't see it, you simply give them the starts of sentences and they have to come up with a chunk to complete the sentence. That's a nice short-term memory test for them that builds in recycling and repetition. Now, where would the actual teaching of the grammar come in this sort of sentence builder chunked approach? Well, firstly, as we saw in the last presentation, the advice is generally, if you're going to teach grammar points, keep it succinct, keep it concise and simple, and make sure students can match the form of the grammar clearly to the meaning. That's really important. It's good to do this once the structures have been used repeatedly in the input. That's what I spoke about last time with reference to the NCELP.org. By the way, for those who don't know it, the NCELP is the National Centre of Excellence set up a year or two ago at the University of York in England. Well worth going to look at their site, at the resources and presentations for teachers on things like grammar and vocabulary. You might want to drill a new structure if you think it's appropriate. So in that case, the perfect tense, I watched a film, you could easily work up a little audiolingual style drill there, so they could say lots of sentences all beginning with I watched or I listened to, whatever it might be. We can term this pop-up grammar, if you like. So this is the idea that the grammar was shown in the input, practiced repeatedly, then you point out a rule, you get them to notice the rule, and then you explain the rule and perhaps then practice it a little bit further. But one of the points I want to get across here pretty clearly is that, and actually I could have made this point in the last session as well, was that it's very easy as a teacher to spend a lot of time explaining grammar and to imagine because you've explained it at great length, then students have got it and can use it. If you've only got a limited amount of time per week, probably quite a small percentage of that time is usefully spent explaining grammar. Far better that the rest of the time is used communicating in the language, whether it be through texts, pictures, sentence builder frames, whatever it might be, because really grammar is going to be acquired through practice above all else and input, not so much explanation. So if you're spending half an hour explaining things and getting children to write down lovely grammatical notes, you've got to think to yourself, what's the surrender value of that sort of activity? Is that time better spent actually using the language? So it's about using the language, not talking about the language. Other chunking techniques that you can use are narrow reading and narrow listening. If you're going to test vocabulary, rather than do it by single words, why not do it in chunks or short sentences? That has more communicative value for students. And if you're working with texts or, for example, sequences of pictures, you could try and build into your teaching the recycling of the highest frequency chunks, particularly verb chunks, so that students, particularly weaker ones, have got these nice, reliable chunks of language in their repertoire that they can use when they need to, for example, in some sort of oral exam. It's very easy as well to start lessons with chunk-based drills, even simple things like quick translation. You give them the English, they come back with the target language phrase, or vice versa. Or, for example, you start a sentence, they finish a sentence, as in oral gap fill. Here's an example of what we call narrow reading. And in this case, I've highlighted phrases where we have the same chunks being reused on numerous occasions. So this is a French sentence builder on the topic, when you were young. So it's talking about your family life and your activities now compared with when you were young. So there's a focus on present tense and imperfect tense. So in green here, I've picked out je m'entends, I get on well with, je m'entends bien, je m'entends, je m'entends. If I pick out the ones in red, quand j'étais petit, when I was small, quand j'étais petite, when I was small, and again there, and again there, and again there. Now, this principle of taking a whole group of texts with repeated chunks is called input flooding. And the idea is that by flooding your language input with the same chunks repeatedly, there's more chance of those chunks being held in working memory and then finding their way eventually through to long-term memory. So that's called input flooding. Now in this case, there are some questions in English that could be used, and you could do lots of other exercises here, transcription, questioning, oral gap fill. There's a mine of information of types of activity you can use with a narrow reading task of that sort. Now, if you want to know a bit more about lexicogrammar, could I recommend two readings from my friend Gianfranco Conti's blog, The Language Gym. That's the first one there. It's sort of the principles of teaching through patterns, lexicogrammar sort of teaching. So that's part 1 and part 2. That's a reference to the Michael Lewis book, The Lexical Approach there. And to finish off, just references to our books there, Breaking the Sound Barrier, The Language Teacher Toolkit, and that's my book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. So that was talking about a practical application of lexicogrammar, giving students some instant confidence and success and feeling that they can use the language in a communicative way. And there are quite a lot of teachers who've taken on board that kind of approach and tell me and tell Gianfranco how well their classes are going and how their students have gained in confidence. So it's one approach amongst several. It's one to look at critically, it's one to see whether it suits your own style and whether it could work with your own classes. Next session is going to be about teaching grammar through question-answer techniques. Thank you for listening in once again, and hope to see you again.